Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Chris Link. I'm an integrative and functional medicine doctor and the medical director of the Integrative Medicine Clinic in Jefferson City, Missouri. I'm really pleased to be here tonight at Columbia Strength and Conditioning speaking about fasting. I want to thank Nate and Scott for inviting me to speak. And I want to thank you for being here on this night. You could be lots of other places like the log boat down the road. They're enjoying a cold one and some friendly conversations. But I think you'll be glad that you're here. We're going to talk about fasting and how fasting is one of the very most important tools in medicine to help optimize health and even reverse important medical conditions like diabetes or elevated cholesterol, etc. I trained as an emergency physician and did emergency and trauma medicine for over 20 years. I saw people with just innumerable amount of serious medical conditions stemming from diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, hypertension, all of these serious underlying conditions that can lead to things like strokes and heart attacks, very important problems. I recognized that it was probably much better to intervene earlier in a person's life in a preventive medicine way. And so I trained with Dr. Andrew Weil, the father of integrative medicine, to learn about the fundamentals of integrative medicine and functional medicine. And I opened the Integrative Medicine Clinic in 2007. Tonight, again, the talk is on fasting. I hope you enjoy it. And I think you'll take home some very important information about how to practically implement fasting into your life in a healthy way that makes a difference for optimizing your health. So we fast for lots of reasons. We used to fast because food was hard to find, right? We fasted for things like religious reasons. We know that when you fast, anybody fast out there? Days intermittent fasting or day here, day there, right? You know, it's interesting that it's a bit of an internal struggle, and we found like in religious things that it kind of intensifies experiences when you fast. It's an interesting thing, and certainly with that, fasting clearly helps with weight loss. We'll talk more about that. And it can treat medical conditions. You know, I can have somebody that comes into me with a serious autoimmune condition, like rheumatoid arthritis, where their joints are swollen, they're chronically fatigued, they're really ill, actually, and they can't move very well. And I can fast them in a medically supervised fast for 10 days, and I can just turn around their rheumatoid arthritis. It's really quite impressive. Fasting is done all around the world. In the US, we're kind of slow. We're kind of late at this ballgame. You know, the Russians have done some amazing research on fasting, and the Germans, in fact, one of the biggest public hospitals in Germany is called Charity Hospital over there. It has a whole floor designated to fasting, and they might put people in there for 10 days, 15 days, 20 days. Interesting. In fact, I'll show you a link to a movie related to that later on. And I think probably the most important thing to think about fasting is about health, and really it's health span. You know, it's not necessarily how many years we have of life, although we want a long life. It's really how much life we have in all of our years, right? So that the vigor and the fun and the intensity that we can live. And so that's health span, and that's different than just longevity. Now this guy, and this is one of my favorite sages, he said, a little starvation can really do more for the average sick man than can the best medicine and the best doctors. Yeah, Mark Twain, right? This is on the cover of The Economist magazine. Obesity has tripled since 1970. Make sure I got working this thing. Oh, there it is. Diabetes has went up 7-fold. There we go. Cancer continues to increase. I think I'm going to do this here. It's a little bit more rapid. And Americans are simply eating about 400 more calories today in 2019 than we did back in 1970. So you know that if you're going to lose a pound of weight, you've got to burn about 3,500 calories, right? So if you're eating an additional 300 or 400 calories a day, in 10 days you're going to gain a pound. So it's not terribly surprising that America's different now. Our health is different. The obesity is different. In this last year, America, for a long, long time, longevity has increased. You know, the average man and woman in 1900 lived about 40 years or 45 years. Actually, men lived a little longer than women because women died in childbirth. So 100 and so years ago was 40 years, and it's went up and up and up. So maybe lifespan's like 80 years or something like that now, right? But in the last couple of years, it's actually went down. Longevity in America is decreasing. So 2 million years ago, food was scarce, fasting was inevitable, and activity was abundant, right? And now food is abundant. Feasting is almost inevitable, right? Everywhere we go, there's food, and activity is scarce. And it turns out, and there's a nice application for this, Sachin Panda, who does some great research on fasting out of the Salk Institute, he has an app that he developed, and he tracks when people eat. And the average American now eats when they wake up in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, and they're eating till 9:30 at night. So they're eating all day long. We didn't used to do that. It's a real difference in what's going on in the way we eat. If you look at this slide right here, so really the only way to turn this evolution back to where we really need to be is to have less calories. Now there's a little bit more than calories, because we know it's more than calories in and calories out. It's kind of when you eat and the kind of food you eat and your activity, but it's got to be at least partly calorie restriction. And this slide's really about health span and the importance of that. So the average American lives about 79 years, but the average American has significant illness by the time they're 60, right? Arthritis, diabetes, early heart disease, other autoimmune diseases. So we have significant illness. So the health span isn't so good. So we want to improve the lifespan, but we also want to improve the health span. And what we talk about is kind of squaring off this curve. So a person lives vigorously until their 80s or 90s. And then, they die in their sleep. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But at least they have a more capacity as we get older. And it's really there. I think that's really possible for us. So what improves health span? We know that all of these things, and I know that Nate Scott teaches everybody here that comes about nutrition and exercise and how important sleep is for us and how important social connectedness is as well. All of these things we know improve health span. Calorie restriction does too, and it does many things like prevent diabetes, it reduces arthritis, it protects against cardiovascular diseases, it delays osteoporosis, preserves brain function, cognition, it delays muscle loss, protects against colon health, delays brain atrophy, and lowers cancer occurrence and progression. So when we calorie restrict, we can impact a lot of the factors that decrease our health and our longevity. So have you seen some of these studies? You know about some of the calorie restriction studies where they, back in the 1930s or so, they took different organisms from yeast to worms to mice and finally to monkeys. And they calorie restricted them. So they gave them about 70% of their normal daily calories. And they did it over their lifespan. And these organisms, whether it's a yeast or a mouse or finally the monkeys, and I'll show you that study in just a minute, they live significantly longer. And not only did they live longer, they lived stronger. Let me show you an example of this. So, you may not be able to see this really well, but the monkey, there's two different monkeys here. This one in the A and B panel, and there's a different monkey in the C and D panel. Both of them are the same age. This monkey over here, and you can see he's lost some of his coat in the back, his muscle mass is gone. He kind of looks forlorn. This monkey over here looks like a kid. He's got a little bit more vigor in his face. Again, they're the same age, but this one on this other side, on the right side, was calorie restricted for its life. This was a very famous study done at the University of Wisconsin. In fact, some of these monkeys, so this was in 2009 when this was published, and it was after 20 years. And the monkeys that were calorie restricted were significant, it was 80% of them were still alive. And not only were they living longer, they were stronger. There are some of these monkeys still alive in 2019, in their 40s. Really, really extraordinary. The problem is that the problem is it's hard to get human beings to calorie restrict to 70% of their daily calories, right? There is something called the Calorie Restriction Society. Anybody heard about that? You will now and there's a famous study going on at Washington University in St. Louis called the Crony study. where they have a group of people that they're calorie restricting to about 70% of the normal calories per day. So for an adult male, instead of 2,500 calories, they're getting about 1,800 calories. Or for an adult woman, maybe 1,600 calories versus 2,000 calories a day. And it clearly shows in these studies that they have less disease. The problem is there not very many people are going to be compliant to that, right? Not very many people are going to want to eat 30% less calories every day for the rest of their life. So now we're going to talk about the types of fasting. And when I just came in here tonight, I talked to Nate some, and we talked about how to keep it simple for people. You know, just some basic concepts of good whole food, great exercise, good sleep, and how those things can significantly impact people's health. So there's calorie restriction, and there's intermittent fasting. You've heard that, right? In fact, almost everybody I see in my clinic now is intermittent fasting, right? And that's kind of a nebulous term because, you know, you can fast for a few hours here or skip a lunch here and you're intermittent fasting. I think that's a great idea, but it doesn't really define anything very well. Time-restricted feeding does. What time-restricted feeding is about is eating in a window, a certain window, say, and I'll define this a little bit better, but maybe 10 hours a day. So you might be eating from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. You're eating in a window. In the other part of the day, you're not eating. Really a lot of power to that. And it's fairly well defined. And if you're trying to lose weight, you might compress that window into 4 or 5 hours. So you might eat from noon to 5 or from 1 to 6 or something like that. And you might do it many days a week, not necessarily every day. And then there's things like water fast. Has anybody done that? Yeah, Scott raised his hand. So, you know, those are intense. Water fasts are intense, but it can certainly be done, you know, and when, after a couple of days, when you really start burning ketones and you're burning your body fat, the ketones in your blood go up, it makes you not hungry. It's incredible. It also gives you kind of a lucidity, an increase in your cognition that it's very recognizable. There's a kind of an elation that happens. Very interesting. And maybe that's part of the religious things too, you know. The other thing is you get very tuned to food. You know, if you're fasting 2 or 3 days in a water fast and somebody walks about 3 blocks away from you with some French fries, you know they're there. You just do. You can really smell it. And then there's other diets like the 5-2. This is another diet that they use in Europe a lot, where they take like Mondays and Tuesdays and they have a very low calorie, like 500 calories a day for 2 days, and the rest of the week they eat normal. Those people do well too, and they lose some weight. And then there's the fasting mimicking diet by Dr. Longo. Have you heard of Dr. Longo? Yeah, famous guy. And this is really neat, and they're doing all sorts of very interesting things. I'll talk more about the fasting mimicking diet towards the end. I'm going to focus more on fasting in general and the time-restricted eating, which I really think is the foundation for good health. These are all of the benefits to fasting. Weight loss, fat burning, lower glucose, better cholesterol, decreased cellular proliferation. That's another way of saying anti-cancer, right? Slower aging. There's these hormones. Probably some of you guys have some biochemistry, but you don't need to. But there's these particular cellular signals called mTOR, for example, and insulin-like growth factor 1 that are involved in helping us build muscle. So we want them in the right places at the right time, but they're also involved in cancer production and actually increasing the risk of aging. So I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of or knows about things like growth hormone, and we used to give growth hormone. Maybe some people have heard about that in regards to trying to help with longevity. And now there's things called ipamorelin. Has anybody heard of that? So that's no, okay. So it's you know, there's these things called peptides and other things that are used in bodybuilding these days, and people that want to improve their physiques that may be playing with some dangerous things in regard to pushing our own growth factors in our body because of cellular proliferation. I think we need to be careful with those things. So let's talk a little bit about energy and how this all works. So, you know, you eat your food, you got these major macronutrients, the carbs, the proteins, and the fats, and they provide energy. But there's another way we can provide energy to our body, and that's the energy we store in our fat, right? So our body fat is really an energy reserve for us. And after about 9 hours for a woman and about 12 hours for a man, when you've not eaten, you're going to burn your own body fat. And when you do that, you break those long fat chains down. They're usually about 20 carbons long to these chunks, these 4-carbon chunks called ketones. And ketones are a great energy currency. They provide that fuel and energy. They create that elation that I talked about. But they're also a signaling molecule in the body. And that's one of the glorious things about ketones. They do much more than just provide energy. So, well, ketones, clearly when you're burning ketones, and we can measure it in the blood and measure it in the urine, you're going to be working towards weight loss. But you also decrease cancer because the ketone actually goes to a place on our genome called the histones through an enzyme called histone deacetylase, and it decreases the likelihood of cancer production in our body by having ketones. So if we do time-restricted eating every night, get that 12, 13, 14 hours, and we get ketones up after 9, 10, or 11, or 12 hours, our body gets exposed to that every night, and that's going to help improve our longevity and decrease abnormal cellular proliferation in our body. And then there's this thing called BDNF and GDNF, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So this is an important factor that goes up in our body with ketones, and it helps create new neurons in our brains, including places like our hippocampus, which is our memory retrieval center. Very, very important. Exercise generates this, and fasting generates it. Ketones, when you have high ketones in your body, you just don't feel like eating. It's really interesting. When I do the fasting mimicking diet, the Prolon, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, on day 4 and 5, I don't give a hoot if I have dinner. It's like, it's really odd. You know, usually when I get home, I'm ready for a nice dinner and a glass of wine and relax. But when you got the ketones circulating in your body, it suppresses your hunger. It's real, it's noticeable, and it's just really interesting that would happen. And it's a metabolic switch. Have you heard the term about metabolic flexibility? You know, the body mostly burns glucose and glycogen, but you need to get good at burning fat. And some of our top athletes train both in the fasted state and in the fed state so they can train their mitochondria in their body to burn either fat or glucose. Metabolic flexibility. The other thing that's neat about metabolic flexibility, so if you're doing the time-restricted eating and you're good at burning fat and making that metabolic switch in your body, if you just need to skip lunch, who cares? Your body can easily switch because you've already kind of ramped up the enzymes in your body that do lipolysis. Lipolysis is breaking down fat, making ketones available immediately as an energy currency that can go to your brain, to your muscles, all of your organs. And if you just train that for a few weeks, you can do it very readily. So it's very easy to skip meals. So in my life, with my time-restricted eating, I might skip breakfast, like I'm going to do tomorrow, and I won't eat till lunch. And some days, like tonight, I didn't eat dinner, right? So I'll eat breakfast, and so it's very easy to do that and have plenty of energy. And then there's autophagy. Have you heard about this? So this is a term that we're going to learn more and more about in the years to come, because it's really involved in cellular renewal in our body, is what autophagy is. So autophagy, eat yourself. And it turns out the body's really wise. It kind of knows what cells are senescent or old, and it goes selectively to them. And it takes them, and it does this process called apoptosis, where the cell dies, and the body uses the raw materials, the protein and the fats and the glycogen and everything that's in that cell, the DNA, and recycles it. So it gets rid of the laggard, and it's using that raw material again. That's autophagy, and that's turned on by fasting. So when we fast, we have low glucose and low protein and low fat, right? Those 3 macronutrients. Those are signals, those are energy signals in the body. And they turn down these things, mTOR and IGF-1, and they increase ketones, okay? And when all of this happens, and I skipped and I already told you this, when all of this happens, we have increased autophagy. And the autophagy is what helps us renew our cells in our body. I'm going to go through this slide, and then I'm going to walk up here and kind of show you this. Okay, so these are different kinds of fasting and energy in the body. So this top panel here is when a person eats standardly. So the very top line is the glucose in the blood. You see the blips along the top line? Well, those are blips of glucose that go up every time you eat. Okay? And then ketones, when you're eating all day long, from 7:30 a.m. until 9 p.m., you never get any ketones in your body. Never. The ketone line is flat. So this second panel is when a person intermittent fasts, and they're going to fast for a full day. Okay? So after about 12 hours, you see no glucose because they had no meals for those 24 hours. And you can see the ketones going up gradually, right? See what's happening here? So that's a one-day fast. It's an intermittent fast today. The third panel is something called the time-restricted eating. This is something I'm really an advocate of. So this is where the person's compressing their time that they're eating. They're eating most of their food in 6 or 8 hours. You see the blips of glucose here, and then the blips over here. This is a 2-day panel. This is one day, and then the second day. And so every day after they eat, gradually the ketones go up. And they eat, they drop down. They eat, and then they fast overnight. And then it goes up. That's the process that we're looking for. And the interesting thing about this time-restricted eating, you don't have to do it every day. In some studies I'll show you quickly at the end, if you do it 5 days out of 7, you're going to get most of the benefit. So that makes it doable. You know, if we have this science like the calorie restriction, you get only 70% of your normal calories. Nobody's going to do it. So what good does it do? We can do it in animals in the lab, but we have to figure out how to make it workable for all of us, right? And we want to make it easy to be able to kind of weave into the fabric of our lives, right? Not something that we have to just white knuckle or really have to struggle to do. It's got to be workable, something that's relatively easy to do. I could do a whole talk on circadian rhythms. I'm just going to do one slide, okay? There's no question that I talked about calories in, calories out. It's also when you eat the calories that make a difference, okay? So in the day, our digestion's optimal, right? So when we eat food, we're going to be able to get it into our system. We're going to use that food for energy. Our insulin sensitivity, the way our body responds to it and utilizes it appropriately, is much better early in the day. We're busy, so if we got energy that's in the system, instead of storing it as fat, we're using it to think, to move, to exercise, to take care of our kids, whatever is going on in our lives, right? And usually during the day, our food choices are better. I don't know about you, but beer and chips always sound a lot better after 7 o'clock for me, for some reason. Especially during this hockey season. Yes. Okay, so at night, digestion's not so good. Insulin sensitivity is poor. Fat storage increases. So when you eat that food at night, and people make poorer choices about their food. So I always say, if you eat late, you're going to gain weight. It's just that simple. When you eat late, you're going to gain weight. A few animal studies. This is a mouse study. Okay, and mice are active at night. They're nocturnal beings. And if you feed those, so you take a group of mice, half of them you feed during the usual time they're awake, half of them you feed during the usual time they're asleep. Give them the same amount of calories. When you feed them off their circadian rhythm, they gain weight. Same amount of calories. So it's more than just calories in and calories out. It's about the circadian rhythm too. Okay, so this is time-restricted eating, and this is the foundation of it. It's fasting about 13 hours overnight for most people, and figure out what works for you. If it's 12 and a half or 12 or 14, and fasting 3 hours before bed, that's really a key. 3 hours before bed. So, your last meal could be at, first meal could be at 8 a.m., and your last meal at 7 p.m., right? That's really workable for most of us. That's time-restricted eating. And if you do that, you get all of these benefits: metabolism, cholesterol, lower blood sugar, enhanced fat burning, lower inflammation, and you get this nutritional ketosis that happens every night, right? You get the ketosis that happens. And again, 5 out of 7 days. Okay. This is a mouse study, and what they did with mice with time-restricted eating, I'm going to go up here just to explain a little bit better. Okay, so they took obese mice and they gave them the standard American diet. And they let one group of the mice eat anytime they want during the day or night, and the other group, they just time restricted them. They said you can eat during a 12-hour window. The mouse that were time restricted became leaner. Same food, So in this situation, what they did is they took lean mice. Well, those are fat mice. They took lean mice and they gave them the standard American diet. And they let them eat any time and they become obese. They time restrict them, they stay lean. Now the good part is, when you go down here to this last phase, this is a lean mouse, standard American diet, so really not a great diet. We're not talking about whole food, nutrient dense, colorful, anti-inflammatory diet. We're talking about the standard American diet. And you let them party on the weekends. That is, they did the time restricted feeding 5 days a week and still were lean. And that's back to keeping it simple. You guys don't have to be perfect. Sleep, eat colorful food, move, some time restricted feeding. Figure out what works for you. Make it easy. And the other thing to recognize, and I think probably most of you know this, that when you get up in the morning, you're probably not as hungry as you are later in the day. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of that. You do not need to eat breakfast. So we talked about time-restricted feeding. In studies out of the University of Alabama, Dr. Peterson down there, she showed that if you bring that window of food earlier in the day, so you're eating maybe like from 8 to 4 or 9 to 5 rather than say noon to 9, if you bring it earlier in the day, you tend to do better. You have more weight loss, better benefits metabolically. Okay, this is a study of women that have obesity and prediabetes, and there are two groups. The first group, both groups got the same amount of calories, 1,400 calories. The first group, they kind of fed in the standard way. A little bit for breakfast, a moderate amount of calories for lunch, and a larger amount of calories for dinner, 700. The other group, they just flipped it around, and they gave more calories earlier in the day. And the second group, more calories earlier in the day, same amount of calories as the other group, greater weight loss, smaller waist circumference, better glucose, better triglycerides, less hungry. I think that's really important, less hungry. And better fertility, actually. And certainly women come to our practice sometimes, I'm not a fertility doctor, but they say, how can I get healthier so I can be more fertile? And this is one of the things I teach them. So you know the old adage, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. That's a pretty good structure, and you can see it's more, the triangle's a little different in regards to the body physique there too. This is the book by Sachin Panda, the researcher from the Salk Institute. The Salk Institute is the place where they developed the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk in the 1950s. It's a very distinguished place in California. This is the circadian code. This is an interesting read. And if you don't, and for a lot of these people that have these books, if you just go to YouTube, you can find a nice hour lecture, that they'll have that'll summarize their book quite nicely. So this is about breakfast skipping. So how many of you have heard that breakfast is the most important meal of the day? Yeah, right. You just got to eat it, right? And it should be Kellogg's, right? Or maybe some Cheerios, or maybe even some, I don't know, some colorful sugar sweetened something or another that. Okay, so the initial studies showed that people who ate breakfast were less obese. People who ate breakfast were less obese, and they had better cognitive performance in children, and they had less diabetes. Okay. That's what the initial study showed, and that's where those things came from. But it turned out that the breakfast skipper, instead of eating a good nutritious meal at brunch or at noon, they stopped and they had the Krispy Kreme in the break room at 10 a.m., right? So they were eating poor quality food, and they tended to be eating late at night. Okay, so when you look at the studies more carefully, people that don't eat breakfast but don't eat late at night and choose good food during the day do just as well or better than people who eat breakfast. And so out of this crowd here, who's not hungry in the morning typically, or less hungry in the morning? It is really, and many people, their hunger doesn't ramp up. And so you don't feel like you have to eat breakfast. Just make sure that if you're gonna eat that brunch at 10 a.m. or the lunch, that you have good nutritious food. That if you need a snack in the morning, that you go for something like nuts or an avocado or something that's really healthy for us. This is just a little trick out of the journal Diabetes Care. They show that if you eat them, if you're going to add carbs to your meal, if you have the bread first, like when you sit down at the restaurant and they bring you the bread, a couple things are going to happen there. Your blood sugar is going to go higher, and you're much more likely to eat dessert. But instead, because you get this is what happens with your blood sugar and your insulin. But instead, if you eat your meat and your vegetables first, and then have a little bit of carbs to me, but split some sort of dessert, maybe a gluten-free chocolate torte or something like that. With your friends, that can be really good, and you're not going to get the bump in the blood sugar if you have it after your meat and your vegetables. So they simply say eat your bread last, and you can skip the bread, but for most of us anyway. So this paper, I presented this several times to many different people. I found it just astounding, and I gave a talk on cancer a year and a half ago, and there was a group of oncologists there. Not a one of them knew of this study. Okay, so this was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Oncology in April of 2016. And what they did is they took women with breast cancer and they followed them for about 7 years. Half the group, they had them time restrict, 5 days a week. 3 hours before bed, time restricted eating, 3 hours before bed, and 13 hours overnight. The other group, they said, don't worry about time restricting. Both groups just ate their usual diet. The time restricted people had 36% decreased risk of recurrence of their cancer. They had a 22% decreased risk of death from any reason during those 7 years. This was not hard for them to do. And in fact, when they measured other parameters like their cholesterol and their blood sugar, their A1C and their CRP, which is an inflammation marker, and their reflux and their sleep, all were better. All were better. And it just had to do with the time-restricted eating. It's a powerful tool for good health and even cancer. So these are all of the things that we know that calorie restriction can do. Many, many, many things. So the question is how do we avoid the hangry, right? And how do we make it simple? It's the time-restricted eating. It's not eating breakfast if you're not hungry, for example. And it may be incorporating this fasting mimicking diet once in a while. So this is the Prolon. This is developed by Dr. Longo at USC. Done a lot of research behind it. And this is down at the bottom, you can see the fasting mimicking diet. And what that is, you can do it at home. You can buy his box of food. It's $225 for a week. It's really not that, it's really pretty good, honestly. Or you can do it on yourself at home. It just needs to be vegetarian for 5 days, 800 calories, vegetarian. Because it's got to be low sugar and it's got to be low protein for those 5 days. That's Dr. Longo. So it stimulates in a very big way autophagy. And the other thing it does, so that's breaking down of the cells that are senescent and laggards in our body, not doing their thing. And in addition to these senescent cells to being kind of laggards, they also have increased inflammation in our body too. So we really want to autophagize those cells, if that's a word. The other thing it does is it activates stem cells. And you know about stem cells. We know that stem cells help our body repair from our skin to our eyes, to our gut, to our muscles, and to our joints. We know that places like, Dr. Oliver does stem cells in joints to help things repair, right? When you don't eat for 5 days, or you eat this fasting mimicking diet, so it's telling your body you really fasted, though you get 800 calories a day. Your body thinks it's fasted for 5 days. In those 2 or 3 days after you fast, you have a tremendous burst of stem cells. Stem cells are pluripotent. That means they can restore many, many different tissues. The researcher said the people that did the fasting mimicking diet, that their stem cell amounts in their body mimic that of about a 3-year-old child. Imagine that. They recommend that for healthy people like you all, that you might consider it 2, 3, 4 times a year, maybe once a quarter. I'll tell you that I've done it probably 9 or 10 times over the last couple of years. It's just not that hard to do. Steph's done it many times. I think, Nate, you said you've done it once or twice?
I've done it once.
Yeah. It It's really not that difficult. So there's lots of benefits to the fasting mimicking diet. It normalizes glucose, it lowers inflammation, increases stem cells, decreases those senescent cells that cause inflammation in our body, improves our immune system, does all sorts of wonderful things. This is his book. Some of you, if you haven't read it, it's a great book to read. Longo's a neat guy. And that's me hanging with Dr. Longo. That's right in front of his lab at USC last November. Dr. Longo is really considered one of the premier researchers. These are all the benefits of aging. I've kind of went through that. Benefits of fasting. The benefits of fasting. It's about health span. It's about health span. It's about taking that curve of longevity. Instead of having a lot of morbidity, that means bad medical illnesses in our 40s, our 50s and 60s and 70s, to change that and push that out so that we're repairing the roof when we're 95 because we're strong enough and vigorous enough to climb the ladder, carry it over there, and take a sack of shingles up there, and then accidentally fall off. And that kind of brings you all the way back to my ER days, because I exactly saw that an elderly fellow in his 90s that was repairing his roof, and he fell and had sustained such an injury that he died shortly thereafter, and his son was in there with, and we made a decision whether to put him on life support. And his son clearly knew his dad didn't want that, and that he had a great life, and that's what I hope for all of you. Not falling off the roof. But. So these are the types of fastings. The ones I really want you to go home with is the time-restricted eating, and if you can, the early time-restricted eating in a window of about 10 hours a day, something like that. Figure out what works for you. Be flexible. You don't have to be rigid about it. Don't eat breakfast if you don't feel like you really need to. But don't eat late. That's even more important. And then maybe try that fasting mimicking diet. Okay, a couple of resources for you. The Science of Fasting is available on Amazon. If you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful view. It's very interesting about what's going on in Germany and what's going on in Russia, what's going on in the US about fasting these days. And The Magic Pill, if you haven't seen that movie, I'm a integrative functional medicine physician, and it brought tears to my eyes. Because has anybody seen that Magic Pill movie? You got to see it, right? So there is, it's really vignettes of several different families. A woman with cancer, a child with autism, which was amazing how she turned around. Another person with diabetes. Several different people that they follow, and what they did is they put them on a whole food diet. They got the crap out of the house. They got the Cheerios and the Cheetos and the crackers and all of those things out of the house. And they did this for a period of months. And these people, somebody with asthma, their diseases turned around. In my practice, on almost a daily basis now, I have people that come to me with diabetes, who I look them in the eye and say, hey, I can help you turn that around, or coming back to me, having done what we talked about, some movement, some time-restricted eating, low, colorful, nutrient-dense, low-carbohydrate diet, nuts and olive oil and fish, and their diabetes turns around. I've seen it dozens of times, folks. It just happens. People with gut-related issues, it's just amazing. I really enjoy that. Okay, so this is my favorite sage of the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin, he said, to lengthen thy life, lessen thy meals. Time-restricted eating, big. I just want to take this last slide here just to introduce you to a couple other folks at my clinic. Rachel Lynn is a nurse practitioner that works with me, and Jalynn North is also a nurse practitioner. The clinic's been open for we're just coming on our 10th year anniversary. Both of these young women are just very good at what they do, great rapport with their patients, and they really know integrated and functional medicine, because we do lots of education there, just like Scott and me do here. We're involved in women's health and thyroid, abdominal pain, constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel diseases, type 2 diabetes reversal like I just talked about, advanced management of cholesterol, using medications when we need to, but maybe not. autoimmune diseases, weight loss strategies, bioidentical hormones, and children's health. Not so much like following children for their care, but more like when a child has a problem, autism or gut problems or eczema or behavioral things. These are the folks that come to us, and we like it. And so keep it simple. You know, I didn't say much about food. I just want to say this. Eat less of this stuff, right? Don't have to eat perfect, but less of this processed stuff, right? Hot dogs and chips and burgers, you know, or at least the buns. More of this, real food, right? And try to eat when the sun's out. And that's the end of the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Fasting is indeed a very powerful tool in reversal of illness, prevention of illness, and really to optimize health. It's one of the most powerful tools in medicine that's getting a lot more attention in the United States and around the world. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I want to remind everyone that the Integrative Medicine Clinic brings forward the concepts, the powerful concepts of integrative and functional medicine to improve the health of our community, one patient at a time. The next slide will be a series of questions from the audience. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed the talk tonight. Yes, please.
You mentioned frequently that burning fat is increasing a lot. What about those of us that already eating like pretty healthy, like whole foods and not much of the junk, and I don't have any fat to burn? Is any adjustments? Is that what you're saying? If you don't really have any, I don't need to burn more fat.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I want to address two things from that. One is, you know, if you're thin and you don't really need to lose weight, is fasting safe for you and is it healthy, right? And that time-restricted feeding is absolutely healthy because when you throw that metabolic switch from burning glucose to burning fat, that 9 to 12 hours in, you do all of those other wonderful things that restore and rejuvenate the body and give you flexibility, help with the immune system, help with stem cells, help with cancer reduction, yada, yada, yada. Brain-derived neurotrophic factors, so absolutely. The other thing I'll say is that many of you are interested in maintaining your muscle mass. We know that that's important as we age, that it's a currency really for good health as we go further in life. When you fast, ketones turn off the muscle loss. So when you hit the ketone, you turn off the muscle loss. The other thing you can do is when you fast, if you weight lift, and when I do my fast, I absolutely exercise. You turn up mTOR. mTOR is something that builds muscle, and you turn it up locally, right where you want it, to maintain the muscles of your thighs, your hips, and your arms and shoulders. So you want to do some exercise. Now, you don't go out and run 30 minutes in 95-degree heat when you're a little bit dehydrated from fasting. Use your common sense, but doing some exercise is a good idea, weightlifting in particular, to maintain muscle. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I was just a little bit curious. At the beginning, you say ketones decrease cell proliferation, and later fasting activates stem cells, which involves proliferation. And so I'm just curious how those two things how can be anti-proliferative for cancer, but pro-proliferative for stem cells.
And I'm going to look all of you in the eye and say, I have no idea. I don't have the answer to that. We do know that it definitely, the extended fasting definitely turns on stem cells. We love what that does. We can measure those pluripotential stem cells in the blood, things that rejuvenate so many things like our blood vessels, et cetera. And we also know that the ketones, beta-hydroxybutyric acid and acetoacetate, go right to the DNA and turn down abnormal proliferation. So how it differentiates is the beauty of the human physiology that I don't know. And I'll tell you something else. When you go to the internet and read about fasting, these people that are out there teaching about it, some of them know what they're talking about, the majority don't. We don't know specifically if for a fasting mimicking diet is 5 days better than 6, or 5 days worse than 4, or is for time-restricted feeding is 13 hours better than 14 hours. We don't have that data yet. This is early on, but we know that these things benefit, and we need to tease that out. So if anybody tells you that this is exactly the way you need to do it, they haven't read the literature more carefully, or as carefully as they need to. And they certainly didn't go to the first international conference on fasting like I did last year. So, anybody else?
So,
Please.
let's say that you do the 800 fast mimicking diet for 5 days.
Yes.
You have to be careful. Specific. I know you say eat healthy, try to make those healthier choices. But what I've heard, if you do extended long-term water fasting, obviously you've got to get your gut moving back up. You got to be real careful about what you eat when you basically come back on the food. If you do significant calorie restriction, you have to be careful about anything basically before you go back to normal.
So the question is that when if you ramp down because you're fasting or doing the fasting mimicking diet for several days, would it be a good idea to go out and have some big meal? Common sense will tell us no, and that's what the clinical experience is too. But the data, just like I mentioned before, we don't know all of these things. We know that it's probably pretty clear that if you haven't eaten for 5 days because you've done a water fast, that your pancreas that produces things like enzymes that break down proteins and fats, and the acid-producing cells in your stomach are really sluggish, right? So I'd say ramp it up. And the thing is, for most of us healthy folks, if you screw it up, your body's going to tell you, because you're going to get diarrhea, you're going to get nausea, you're not going to feel well. It's not going to cause any major. For most of us, it's going to be some big detrimental problem that's going to cause any long lasting, but it's not going to be comfortable. So I'd say use common sense. Who else? Please.
You mentioned you can eat more salt. Salt is good with the fast, in reference to that 5-day, 800. But with the time restricted fasting, is that still okay? You can eat a lot of salt. I love salt. So is that still okay?
Is it?
Time restricted? And let me just throw it out there. I get quite a bit of exercise.
Yeah. So let me just answer the question like this: is salt okay for a healthy human being? Absolutely. When we look at the data, this people that eat 5, 6, 7 grams of salt, so a couple of teaspoons of 5, 6, 7 grams of sodium, so that's 2 teaspoons full of salt a day, they do pretty darn good. That's not what the American Heart Association tells us, but they're plain wrong. When we've looked at the data of healthy human beings, they do quite well. In fact, when you restrict sodium significantly in healthy folks, even people with cardiovascular disease, you get them down to 1,500 milligrams of sodium like they recommend, their mortality goes up. There's a few people that have such terrible congestive heart failure that we better be very, very careful with it. But the truth is, a moderate amount of salt is just fine for most of us, probably more than we think. Now, if you eat real food, and you're not eating chips and you're not eating from fast food restaurants, you're not going to get excessive amounts of sodium, even if you salt your food. I say some things, and I recognize it because I see it in some of your eyes, that you're not used to hearing. That's different than what the standard information is out there. I read this literature very, very carefully, and I don't say things in public that aren't based in literature. And so salt is safe for us in moderate amounts, and more than the American Heart Association. The American Heart Association and American Diabetic, and I don't want to just poo-poo medicine because we do a lot of great things in standard medicine. And I'm an integrative physician. One of my foot is solidly in standard and conventional medicine. But we don't have it right in a lot of ways. Like the American Diabetic Association tells diabetics to have 50 or 60 grams of carbs with a meal. That's just not right. That's not what I see. That's not how I reverse diabetes in my clinic. I don't tell them just eat steak or cheeseburgers, but when you eat a lot of kale and beets and carrots and lentils and beans, you're not getting all that many carbs, and then you can have your meat and your fish and all of these things, and you do a whole lot better. Right? So it's about having the data and being cautious about how we apply it, and recognizing that medicine's a big ship to turn. Good information on that. Any other questions? You guys are great. Okay, go ahead, please.
So you talked about how it's benefited for fertility. Does it also benefit your menopause? It's not much fun for some of us during that phase.
Well, that menopause is a little bit like being on a merry-go-round with a roller coaster. So there's no question if a woman is in menopause, where she eats well, a low-carb, nutrient-dense, colorful diet, does time-restricted eating, her physiology is going to be better. She's going to have less symptoms. Some women sail in menopause. Estrogen goes down, they don't have much trouble at all. Another women, even when they're doing everything right, maybe taking some omega-3s and taking some basic supplements and exercising and all that, you'll still have some trouble. And those people, then you need to think about hormone replacement therapy. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I'll tell you, there's also a lot of misinformation about that. And any woman here that's anywhere near menopause that's thought about hormone replacement therapy, pick up the book called Estrogen Matters by Evelyn Wooding. Estrogen Matters. Estrogen Matters. It's a very good book. That I think in an unemotional way looks at the data of the Women's Health Initiative, which told us actually that estrogen is safe for men and women.
It's also written it's also written for the public. I mean, it's an easy read.
Thank you. Yes.
Science.
Okay.
Chemist.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. What a great turnout. And thanks, Scott. Thanks, Nate, for having me. This is great. I enjoyed it. Fasting. And out there was really an interesting conference. There was about 100 people. About 50 of them, about half of the audience were the researchers from places like Germany and Australia and Italy, people that are actually doing the research. David Sabatini, who's the guy who did the research on mTOR. And you guys, if you haven't heard this, you're going to hear about mTOR because mTOR is very, very big in longevity. And there's just some really interesting things about that. So he was there, just great researchers. And it was nice to be able to hear them speak and what they're doing. These are safety considerations for fasting. If you're a type 1 diabetic and you're insulin dependent, you'd better have very close supervision by a doctor. If you're a type 2 diabetic, I do this in my type 2 diabetics all the time, still you need some supervision with that. If you're 70 or older, it's not that you can't do it, but you need to be careful. In older mice, when we did the fasting mimicking diet in older mice, some of them, we stressed the crap out of them, and it caused increased cortisol, increased epinephrine, and actually some premature death in some of them. So we have to be careful about that. People with hypertension, what I find is that they have to not take their blood pressure medication. Because when we fast them, all the glycogen in your muscles holds water. Glycogen is a storage molecule for glucose in our muscles in our body. It holds water. And when you burn through that glycogen, you lose a lot of water. You lose a lot of volume of fluid in your body, and your blood pressure goes down. So I like people to drink much more water, and I like them to salt their food highly, salt their food even more. The green line, so if you go back to 1960, there was about 10% of our population, was obese. If you come to 2010 or beyond, we have about 30% obesity in our country. And we can see that the calories, the green lines are the calories, about 400 calories more per day. Significantly different, and just a whole lot more obesity. And interestingly, by the way, over that same period of time, the percentage fat in the human diets went down. So in the American diet in the 1960s, people ate about 45% of their calories from fat, right? And now it's significantly lower. It's about 33% of our calories from fat. So we're eating less fat, and we're gaining more weight, right? And it's got to do with the processed carbs, right? And you may have seen some of the headlines in the last couple of weeks where it said ultra-processed foods and increased likelihood of early death, right? And that means the kind of things that comes in boxes or that come through your driver's side window, right? Those are those ultra-processed foods that aren't so good for us.